This is David Bernstein, founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and this is the SpeechCast, a joint venture of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and the Speech Project of the Jewish Journal. I'm delighted to have with us today the Josh Kraushaar, who is the politics editor of the National Journal and the Against the Grain columnist. One of the political commentators that I really look for when the situation gets interesting. I think I was probably following you, Josh. Every tweet that you tweeted out on election night and even messaging you. In the interest of full disclosure, by the way, Josh was also an intern of mine at the American Jewish Committee going back a long time ago. So great to see you, Josh.
Yeah, I was going to say, David, don't bury the lead. You were my first boss in the professional world. So my time early on, right after graduating from college at the American Jewish Committee. So then I moved on to political journalism since then. But I'm glad to have remained in touch.
You were a very good intern as well, by the way, I must say. So these are some interesting times, and we've had an opportunity sort of offline to talk about them. And I was really eager to get you on the SpeechCast to go into some greater depth. A few weeks ago, James Carville came out and said that the current woke politics, and I'm paraphrasing here, are going to be potentially disastrous for the Democratic Party in future elections. It's not playing well in the electorate. I know you've looked into that in some detail, and I'd love to get your take.
Yeah, well, I've been writing about this for quite some time, long before this became sort of the big political cause celeb. And one of the most fascinating topics in today's politics that I write about is that there is this movement, this very woke movement, as you note, that seems to have gained purchase within the Democratic Party, its leadership, the people who work at the White House and political professionals that make up so many talented folks in Congress and the bureaucracy. And yet when you look at elections, which is what I do on a daily basis, you look at the voters, Democratic Party voters in election after election after election, there is just a limited constituency for this left-wing, woke, progressive, whatever you want to call it, anti-racist, is the latest word, I guess, that this very progressive worldview has very little purchase, not just among moderate Democrats, but also among a lot of non-white Democrats. The main audience for a lot of this woke stuff is very left-wing, white, progressive Democrats. And that doesn't make up much of even the Democratic Party voting base. We saw this most recently or recently in 2020, where you had candidate after candidate running for the presidency, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, all trying to compete for that maybe quarter to third of the Democratic Party that really wanted purity on these woke issues. And then you had Joe Biden, who kind of ignored the Twitter noise, ignored social media, ran where the voters were, which is much more moderate on these cultural, racial, social issues, by virtue of experience, by virtue of understanding where a lot of mainstream rank and file Democratic voters are. And the competition wasn't even close. I mean, even no one really gave Biden a chance, if you remember, throughout much of the primary process. Yet you had Warren and Sanders and Harris literally saying the same things well out of the mainstream on not just general election voters, but among Democratic Party voters. And they were splitting that same quarter to third of the Democratic primary vote up. And then you had Joe Biden, who was offering a moderate message that was appealing to African-American voters in South Carolina. And more importantly, the moderate, pragmatic voters across the country. And it wasn't close. I mean, Biden won the election in a rout. Elizabeth Warren was actually probably the purest or the candidate with the purest distillation of sort of the woke worldview in that primary field. She didn't even finish in second place or first place in any state in the country. She didn't even finish and didn't even win in her home state. I think she finished third in a very Democratic state like Massachusetts. So, I mean, this is just I had written about just the fact that Joe Biden was constantly being underestimated because he was actually telling a message that was not where social media was, but where Democratic Party voters were. And yet you see this over and over again in New York mayoral election. Same dynamic, a very liberal city where you have a lot of the Democratic candidates running to appeal to this very woke left-wing constituency, and it's not the winning one. And Eric Adams, or Catherine Garcia, even, who seems to be the closest competitor, we'll see how the results shake out. They were much more successful by talking about crime, by Adams directly attacked the white, bougie, progressive worldview on crime, on racial justice. In his campaign, and he had credibility as an African American, a former police captain. So, I mean, there is this disconnect. This is the story, I think, of the Democratic Party in our times. There's this disconnect between your average voters, Democratic voters, and where social media and the activists and the people who are the elites of the party are. And it's creating just this weird dynamic where, right now, I think Biden is being pressured to do things that aren't in his own political self-interest. But I mean, more importantly, like, Democrats are doing things. They could be winning elections. They could be moving to the middle. They could be speaking out and speaking reasonably on some of these very, very, very important racial, criminal justice issues, policing. I mean, these are important issues.
Right.
But instead, they're being helped, and it's not helping them politically.
Yeah. So there's some evidence that that the Democrats lost ground on particularly Latino voters and maybe even African American voters in the 2020 elections. What is that evidence? What is that? What do we know about this? Not looking forward from that, but looking back in the last couple of election cycles.
Yeah, I mean, there have been plenty of studies looking at the 2020 election results, fascinating studies done by Democratic groups, which show that Donald Trump actually made among his most significant gains, not among white voters, but among voters of color. And when you look down ballot, you look at the Senate races, the House races in particular, you see Democrats losing ground in some unlikely places, like South Florida, majority Hispanic districts in South Florida, Orange County, California, where Hispanics and Asian Americans make up a majority, I believe, of a lot of these key congressional districts. The Rio Grande Valley, where you have working class Hispanic voters, caring about the economy, caring about energy policy, not caring about some of the cultural guideposts where the Democratic Party has been and was in the 2020 election. So
do we have specific evidence that this rhetoric around racial justice is alienating, or do we just know that it's not in their sort of area of focus?
Well, we do know that we can look at the messaging, right? The in those races that I talked about in the advertisements we saw, Republicans focused heavily on attacking Democrats for indulging this defund the police ideology, this belief. And in those districts where that message was most prominent, Republicans made outsized gains. We know that's what the results and the data show from the 2020 election. We know that interestingly enough, that it, like I said, took place among voters. The voters that swung most wildly away from the Democratic Party in 2020 were voters of color. They weren't white upscale suburban voters. They weren't even the white working class voters that were already largely in the Republican column. The most persuadable voters were voters of color who, again, the messaging in those areas were very, very concentrated on social, cultural issues, defund the police. In South Florida, the specter of socialism. In fact, remember Bernie Sanders got in trouble for saying nice things about Fidel Castro right before the Florida primary. Joe Biden, I think it was like 80 to 20%, just a mopping in the Democratic primary from Biden against Sanders, just because the notion of socialism, the notion of these kind of left-wing positions was so toxic in areas that were until recently very, and still are, frankly, very politically competitive.
Right. So I always embraced this theory of politics, American politics, that political parties learned and then forgot their lessons and learned again. It was sort of like, I called it like a political cycle. So, for example, Dukakis was the Democratic nominee, did terrible, lost. Democrats learned the lesson. Then they put up Bill Clinton, who was a winnable candidate and won the election. And that what happens is when there is a more conservative Democrat, in office, the progressive forces slowly gain ground, resentment builds, they end up unlearning the lesson of centrism, and then so on and so forth. Yet it seems that on both parties, perhaps, although I'm more familiar with the cyclical nature of the Democratic Party, both parties perhaps might be captured by an ideological wing that making them so that they're no longer able to sort of internalize these political lessons. And no matter what happens, they will not be able to say this politics of wokeness is getting us in trouble because they're now controlled by the very people that they're trying, that they'd have to sort of move on from. Am I wrong about that?
No, I mean, you've identified one of the big conundrums in our politics, in our modern politics, which is that typically, historically, when voters get rejected, when they get a bad election result, they move in the other direction. They move to the middle if they went a little too far to the left. They learn lessons from the last election. By the way, this is clearly a Republican problem. I think even more clearly, perhaps, because Republicans are afraid to say anything cross about Donald Trump, with few exceptions, because they're worried about losing the base, and the base is in their mind all important. And I think they're actually on the Republican side, they're actually making the correct crass political calculation. Yeah, I mean, like 75-80% of Republicans are loyal to Trump, and that's the reality. So they're doing things, they're playing to their base, they're doing things that may not be in their self-interest for a general election, but if they can't get out of their primary, they're in this catch-22 situation.
Right.
Have a more favorable political situation in that if you look at all the data, even as the party's moving a little bit more to the left, got about half of the Democratic Party electorate still identifying in a more moderate tradition, and still being much more pragmatic than their Republican Party counterparts. So where the Republican Party challenge is of their voters have just become almost a cult of personality towards Donald Trump. The Democrats actually have a much more favorable electorate where they can move to the middle, where they can build out, where they can not have to pander or indulge these extreme tendencies from within their party. And their problem is one where their leadership has become almost intoxicated with these ideas that are politically unpopular, politically toxic. But they're elites, the leaders of the Democratic Party have really bought into a lot of the racial justice, defund the police, and again, like when I say racial justice, I'm talking about these sort of avant-garde ideas where it's often very complicated. It's a complicated conversation, but they're taking the most left-wing position, reparations, right, or belief that you need to teach that the country was born in evil and it's fundamentally a sinful country. I mean, these sort of very extreme ideas that have kind of percolated into the mainstream. They don't have much purchase among a majority of Democratic voters, but there is a powerful, influential faction of the Democratic Party, and it's represented in a lot of the folks who have elite leadership positions, and it's making them make some self-defeating political decisions.
Right. So a lot of the people who supported Biden but were concerned about the wokeness in the Democratic Party, people may or may not, may or may not be one of them, were thought to themselves, okay, well, there's probably going to be some wokeness going on in the Democratic Party, but Biden himself doesn't really represent him, and he'll sort of stave off those forces. Yet since then, I've been sort of surprised at how much this has held sway within the Biden administration. The other day, President Biden used the term Latinx. One of the first things out of the gate was this executive order on equity, which it's not clear, but may have been relying on sort of the Abraham X. Kendi definition of equity, of any disparity is functional discrimination. I'm wondering to what your sense of that is. Is Biden himself and his top cabinet members, are they really bought in, or are they just trying to navigate the politics of the current situation?
Yeah, I mean, David, I think you hit on sort of the fundamental divide within the party with that latter point, where traditional kind of mainstream liberal Democrats have always used the word equality. Equality meaning equality of opportunity, that everyone has the same opportunity to kind of at least try to move towards the same opportunity to achieve their best potential. Suddenly this word equity has appeared everywhere, and you've written about this. You've really dug into it, David. But it is, you see this all over the place when it comes to how the Biden administration talks about every issue under the sun, from environmental policy to social policy to economic policy. I mean, this is all of a sudden a word that was hardly used even by Barack Obama in his administration is everywhere. It defines everything that a lot of top administration officials are saying. And equity tends to mean that you want quality of outcome. You want, almost like it really is socialism in many ways. And that's why that's why these political attacks stick, because there is a reality to a lot of what they're saying. And again, David, I'm glad you pointed out that it was a very small but revealing example of how this strange woke terminology, Latinx, 3% of Hispanics, according to the Pew Research Center, use that term at all. About 80% don't even know what it means of Hispanics. And yet, in a speech designed to encourage Hispanics, encourage Latinos and Latinas to get vaccinated, you're actually talking to that community, and you're using a word that most of them don't even understand when you're speaking.
Is that because some woke staffer of Biden wrote that into his speech, or is that because he himself has sort of been so inculcated in the ideology that he's now using it?
Well, who knows? I mean, I don't have enough original reporting. I can tell you that the people I talk to within the White House don't kind of agree. I mean, there's a sort of a silent majority of people that work, and you probably could guess the names of people that are more on the moderate side and more on the progressive side. But look, Joe Biden is the guy. He gave an interview right after he became president, but I thought was really important. And he said, "You got to speak the language that my parents would understand."
The Scranton folks would understand, right?
Basic politics 101, David. This is not complicated, right? And yet there's some faction within the White House that it goes through the whole vetting process where you still are insistent on using a word that is esoteric, that is not used by the community that you're speaking to. It's condescending, and it's just bad politics. And yet that is a perfect example of just basic stuff, basic blocking and tackling. Yet for some reason, there's this, a constituency, this faction that insists on catering to a very, very tiny part of the Democratic plan.
Yeah, I actually started seeing this about 5 years ago. A former intern of mine was working for the DNC, and he was working in the department that they would have at one time called community outreach, I believe, and now they were calling intersectional efforts. And I was like, okay, so you're now actually talking about reaching out to specific segments as intersectionality, which is a very specific ideological connotation, rather than sort of the old block and tackle politics of old. So I realize that these ideological trends must be making their way through the Democratic Party. And I think it's really showed up. It showed up in 2016, it showed up in 2020, and it's showing up now. And I worry a lot about the direction of the party. I want to pivot a bit. You're in the media. You've spent your career in the media, and you probably have a pretty good idea of what the ideological environment is. We've seen what's going on in the New York Times. Don McNeil, the veteran science reporter, got fired for quoting somebody else making a remark, and probably for some of the other things he said, all of which I think could be easily justified. And then there was James Bennett before him, and there was what happened to Barry Weiss. And you're seeing it elsewhere, obviously, and a bunch of very prominent writers have left their publications to start Substacks and have done fabulously well. So I'm wondering what you're seeing. How ideological has the mainstream media become, in your view?
Well, I'm a little bit disillusioned at times because it does sometimes feel that there aren't a whole lot of adults in the room. You always have in big newsrooms a lot of different opinions, a lot of different powerful personalities. But like at its best, you have a Marty Baron at Washington Post who kind of is the adult in the room, who kind of checks the worst excesses or helps guide the newsroom in a successful and mainstream direction. What I'm worried about is there are fewer and fewer so-called adults in the room, and part of it is the business model of mainstream media. Mainstream media is being challenged. And frankly, many examples where there's no local newspaper to read in many communities. That the business model that sustained the Chicago Tribune, the Boston Globe, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the mainstream papers that everyone grew up reading of a certain age, they're gone, and now you have a more powerful incentive business-wise to play to the base, to play to your audience, to play to your readership. But is
that really good? I don't understand. So Andrew Sullivan leaves, what was it, the New Yorker, I believe. He is literally the most popular writer of the New Yorker, I'm sure by far, goes and starts a Substack, and someone told me he's making like $1 million a year. I mean, how is it that that's good for the business model? I don't understand that.
Well, I don't think it is, though. Go beyond journalism, David. You have these big corporations that you see all over the place that seem to think that catering to, this is like a very, very apt parallel to what we're talking about in the political world. They seem to think that catering to maybe 5% of their workforce is more, and signaling in a very virtuous manner on these progressive issues is more important than catering to the silent majority, right? And even if it involves dealing with a backlash of some sort. Look, there was when I started journalism until quite recently, there was always a very sizable wall between the editorial and the business side of every major publication. I feel like in many cases that wall is sort of dissipating, where you're constantly as a look at TV, maybe a little bit more accessible to some of your listeners. Now CNN, which used to be the place I would always go to get breaking news. That was their brand. It got a nice audience by doing so. They thought it was more profitable. They could get more of an audience by being more opinionated, by being partisan, like Fox, like MSNBC. And you could argue the pros and cons on a business level, but there's no doubt that it's sort of, it's cost them that halo of objectivity, of at least the attempt to be as objective as possible, that really distinguished them in the marketplace, where you did have the Foxes, the MSNBCs, and other folks. They've decided to kind of just basically trend in that direction and give up. So you see that you see this in the print world as well, where the business incentive is so powerful to play to a progressive audience that make up the core of your subscriber base, that you end up sacrificing credibility. End up sacrificing, and there is this trend, especially among younger reporters, where the notion of dispassionate, objective reporting has taken a back seat to, sort of narrative-driven, morally driven progressive activism, and the notion that shouldn't have to hear a side or another point of view, or at least shouldn't even present it in an article, is gaining steam. And the notion
you had those 150 or so, I may have the numbers wrong, reporters who said that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict should now be covered through the narrative of occupation. I don't know if you caught that.
Right. Yeah. This is.
Several unnamed Washington Post and New York Times writers supposedly signed that as well. I don't know if they really
will say that's not. There were a few anonymous report. Most of the people who signed that were from very. I would consider fringe ideological publications, maybe some very left-wing publications. There were a few anonymous signatories from traditional publications, which is kind of eye-opening. But look, I always used to think that, like, take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I always thought there was sort of a vacuum of reporters who really had a grounding in the history. I always used to think you should be sort of a policy expert. I always just wanted to do political journalism. I loved politics. I've read about politics since a very young age. I didn't want to do any other kind of journalism other than covering elections and politics. And I developed something of an expertise in that area. And I think that's kind of an important skill to have as a reporter. So you can ask tough questions. You can challenge authorities.
Right.
I think, too often, and I always like to challenge, people who, you may think they're on the right side, or they have the advantage politically, but you always want to challenge everyone. That's been my modus operandi. There seems to be an emerging point of view especially among younger reporters, that they want to basically be, activists within a newsroom, and they want to advocate for a certain point of view, and that's certainly foreign to my own instincts as how to be a good journalist, and frankly how I was trained and brought up in the media industry.
Do you think that for some reason the publisher, let's say at the New York Times, maybe the Washington Post, feels the need to defer to these younger reporters, or other reporters are coming up the ranks and say, I now must defer to you on these issues of racism in particular, and so therefore I'm going to make these decisions in my newsroom, or I'm going to use a racial equity lens to cover all the news? How do you think that's actually, what is the dynamic of that actually in the newsroom?
Yeah, I don't want to speak for other. I mean, we're a national journal. We're a pretty small newsroom, and we cover policy and politics. So it's a little different from my own personal vantage point than it is in bigger, newsrooms. I will say, David, that social media has been a great equalizer between the powerful and the powerless. That people who, a lot of the folks who are rallying against leadership, or trying to write these petitions and so on, they're usually more in the lower, kind of the entry level side of the. I mean, I hate to generalize, but a lot of it is sort of established figures versus the newcomers, and a lot of the newcomers have utilized. They're very effective. Came up using social media in college and in school, and they're able to kind of flatten the playing field where there used to be a pretty firm hierarchy, not just in journalism and in newsrooms, but everywhere. And now it's just incredibly easy for a powerless junior employee to mount a revolution, and organize and create a power base of their own in a newsroom or any institution for that matter. So I'm now a writer, a columnist, a podcaster. I was a manager. I did have a stint in my career where I was managing staff. It's tough. I don't know if I'd want to do that these days.
Right.
Because it can be challenging to deal with. It used to be sort of, you did have a lot of authority. You did have, when I was starting out, for example, I might not have liked everything my bosses did and said, but I worked hard, I kept my head down and worked my way up the food chain. These days, it's a different mentality, and social media has given this voice, this platform for less powerful junior people to kind of have the same influence or have the same clout as more established, more senior employees.
Right. So we've talked about the dynamic in politics. We've talked about the dynamic in media. Are you an optimist about the possibility of change and restoration of some semblance of normality, or are you a pessimist?
I'm more of a pessimist because I do think that the biggest culprit for a lot of these negative trends, stuff we talked about in politics, stuff we're talking about now in journalism, is social media. It's the technological innovations that have taken place in the last decade or so. And I don't think you put that toothpaste back in the tube. And frankly, I don't think there's any incentive for the Facebooks and the Twitters of the world to act in a socially responsible way to help improve the discourse, improve the caliber of conversation online in this country.
So I recently listened to Andrew Sullivan's podcast, the Dishcast, I think, and he had Jonathan Rauch, who is the Brookings Institute scholar and writer, and he recently wrote a book called The Constitution of Knowledge. I'm going to be interviewing him in a week or so. And it was sort of the optimist versus the pessimist on this front. And Rauch cites the printing press, in that when first newspapers came out, there was a lot of just scurrilous attacks and so forth, misinformation, and over time, we sort of found our center of gravity, and we created intermediating institutions that made it so such reporting and such writing was frowned upon and the like. And he's suggesting that that may be happening now, even in social media. And while we tend to be skeptical about Facebook and Twitter, that they are actually trying to put together some of this in a way that he hopes won't actually stifle freedom of expression of legitimate voices. You don't think he's right about that?
Well, I think Jonathan is a former colleague of mine at National Journal. He's a brilliant writer and author. I don't necessarily disagree with his larger point, but I think if I heard the same podcast you did, I think he acknowledged that it took hundreds of years, like years,
decades. I think I don't know if it was hundreds of years.
So we may be long gone before we see some
right. We have the ability to deteriorate much faster in the 21st century than we did at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, and I think history shows that it's easier to destroy. It's easier, sadly, to destroy institutions, and then it's a lot harder to build back better to reform them. So like that, we're already seeing this big political backlash about defunding the police. About Democrats are waking up to the real consequences politically of what they've been saying. But the damage has been done. Crime is up.
Right, but up in specific places like in Minneapolis, where they actually took seriously the slogan defund the police, and they started defunding the police, and all of a sudden they're facing a huge crime problem, but they're bouncing back. Roush's point was that the news media, even if you think it has become biased on certain issues like racial equity issues and the like, even with the lab leak hypothesis, which they completely discounted in the beginning, once the evidence came out that it actually was a viable theory, they pivoted very quickly and then legitimized that. And he takes, while Sullivan took that as evidence of bias, deep-seated bias in the media, Roush took that as evidence of the self-corrective capacity of the media.
Yeah, I'm more with Andrew Sullivan. I don't see a whole lot of real soul searching. I don't see a whole lot of real course. I mean, it's real just professional vibe credibility. I mean, it's gotten to the point where denying reality is carried a big cost. But I don't think there's been any serious reforms that have resulted as a result of these mistakes or these blunders. So yeah, I mean, look, I think. Like in politics, I am optimistic in the political world that I don't think unpopular positions can survive very long, right? I mean, I do have faith in democracy. I'm much more optimistic, frankly, about the future of our democracy than a lot of folks on the left and right, because I do think that the public as a whole is generally reasonable about a lot of these issues, and democracy may work slowly, but ultimately there is a course correction.
Right. So if you get trounced in enough elections, eventually you'll figure it out.
Yeah, and by the way, like we talked about, like both parties are going to the base. Someone's going to have to win over the middle, right? I mean, we may go back and forth, and one party wins, and they give up their gains, and you have back and forth politics. But ultimately, middle of the road voters still decide elections, and look, you see this with what's going on. On the criminal justice side of things, on education. I mean, even Democrats are walking away from some of these avant-garde, very, very left-wing positions. It's taking place very slowly. In fact, some advocates I've noticed of defunding the police are now saying they never said that in the first place. So there's a certain denial, there's a certain cover-up that's taking place, but that shows politics is working. That's how democracy works. It just takes a long time, and the damage has been significant. With some of these ideas that are frankly. Dangerous and hurt the country.
I have one question I have to ask you before we talk about your Jewish upbringing, which I do in these podcasts because it's it's a Jewish podcast. So CRT, critical race theory, has all of a sudden become this hot button issue. Now there are people like me who are sort of moderate liberals who have been sounding the alarm about wokeness in general, but CRT specifically in K through 12. And it's not that we believe it's everywhere already, but we believe it is starting to spread and being incorporated in various curriculum, in some ways obvious, some ways not so obvious. And we're concerned that that teachers are going to teach a single view of these very complex social realities and dynamics, and that's not healthy, and that's actually runs counter to critical thinking skills. The conservative political conservatives and have latched onto this issue. So people like Tucker Carlson and the like, Chris Rufo, who's a journalist activist, has certainly made a big political issue out of this. And there are there are arguably regressive voices who are claiming that CRT is everywhere and everything, and it's going to kill your children and the rest. And so it's become a highly politicized issue. And I'm starting to see the Democratic or center left wing talking points emerge out of this, that CRT is really just an arcane legal topic and not something that's being taught in any schools. And by the way, we should be teaching about racial disparities. That's sort of the mixed message I've been hearing from the left. What is your take on this? How's this going to play out in elections? And how should we think about this current moment?
Yeah, well, I think this word critical race theory has been the branding of some of these very unpopular ideas, but it really does come down to whether you support indoctrination in education or an actual education of listening to different points of view and debating and discussing. I mean, that you asked me kind of how does my kind of Jewish background, my Jewish heritage kind of affect my thinking on this. I mean, the Jewish tradition is all about debate and discussion and argument. And, we listen to all points of view, and we even embrace the losing side of issues and hold respect to that side of the argument. But what bothers me so much, and why I think this is very politically damaging, is that this so-called critical race theory ideology demands an adherence to a very, what I would consider a pretty illiberal ideology. The whole point of critical race theory and a lot of the way it's practiced, it's taught or the way it's implemented in these diversity trainings or these corporate leadership seminars, is you have to have a certain point of view. You can't discuss, you can't debate, you can't have healthy arguments. If you're white, you don't have the right to talk about racial issues that affect other people. You can't have the healthy discussions that are critical and essential to a democratic society. And look, this is not about, I actually think, looking back at my education, K through 12 education, I wish we learned more about the Reconstruction period, the post-Civil. Like, we learned a lot about the Civil War, learned a lot about the World War, the World War I, World War II. There was sort of I think the curriculum in schools is pretty atrocious on all sides. And I wish there was more good teaching of history about Reconstruction, about the Tulsa race riots, about inequities in our society. Like, that's part of history. That's part of learning.
But isn't there a difference?
Just to finish, David, you teach that this country is irredeemably evil and everything about it is designed to suppress minority. It is a toxic ideology that only encourages division. It divides people, and it doesn't encourage the type of healthy conversations, healthy discussions that are essential to a liberal democracy.
Right. So, it also hits me that there's a difference between teaching some of the history around racism in this country and how to diagnose the present. So, for example, I think we all agree that America, in practicing slavery, was engaging in systemic racism. I think we can agree that during the Reconstruction period, we saw systemic racism. I think we can agree that the Jim Crow laws were a manifestation of systemic racism. Where it gets more complicated is when you sort of diagnose present disparities. And what I think the fault line here is, should we teach our kids or employees at an office place that these disparities that we're seeing, be it in healthcare, be it in criminal justice system, are purely a result of systemic racism, or are those a matter of debate and discussion?
Of course, it should be a matter of debate and what shouldn't be a matter of debate and discussion outside of this is.
But I don't think we would say I think I would be okay with my teacher saying that Jim Crow laws were an example of systemic racism, right?
Of course,
I'd be okay,
yeah.
Right? But if you apply it to the present moment when we're talking about very complicated social dynamics and economic realities and the like, I don't want my son's teacher to teach him that these are purely a function of systemic racism, the same way we could agree on Jim Crow. Because I think it's more complicated.
We should have a discussion about these are complicated issues. And by the way, I think there's an increased sensitivity among K through 12. You can choose to go to wherever you want to go and choose what classes you want to take at whatever college you choose to go to. I'm not as concerned it's another ball of wax to talk about the university side of things.
Yeah, exactly.
But when states and governments set curricula for public schools. So
Right.
like this is different, and kids don't have a choice largely. I mean, I guess you could send them to
Right.
private school if you have the means, but you ultimately are most parents send their kids to public school, and this is not a choice of where you can choose to go. So
Right. And by the way, I think we can agree that
important, and that's why it's just,
we don't want state legislators saying to a college, don't teach critical race theory, right? I mean, that's ridiculous. I think we've seen. I'm not sure where the Pennsylvania legislation is or if it's law at this point, but I know that at least in some of the legislation, it would make it so a state-funded college can no longer teach critical race theory, which seems completely illiberal itself.
yeah, I mean, some of these laws in the states are designed. I mean, they're kind of late to the game, right? These politicians are seeing an opportunity there. They're kind of late to seeing how unpopular, how politically toxic these issues are, and they're trying to figure out a way to get their piece of the pie. I agree with you. I think a lot of this, not all of them, but like a lot of the state laws, I have problems with. But I think there's a political component as well as a kind of a legal and intellectual component as well. That I think the best way to fight discrimination is doing things through the liberal through the legal system, through our American system, argue, debate, expose the illiberalism from within a lot of these ideas. But yeah, I mean, look, ultimately, school boards have to set curricula. I mean, this is a local political issue as well. There are going to be debates and there are going to be policies set at the local level, and I think that there is a political component to it.
Sure. So you grew up in Westchester, right?
No, I watched the Northern Virginia. I mean, I grew up in.
Oh, you grew up in Northern Virginia. That's right. I know because I know your uncle who lives in Westchester, I think. How did you grow up? Did you where? How has your Jewishness? How did your Jewish upbringing affect your thinking about politics, about journalism, and so forth?
Yeah, so I went to Jewish day school. I grew up, went to a conservative synagogue. Very, very engaged. Family with Judaism was very important to them, both religiously and I guess culturally as well. Like I said before, David, I always have been something of a the against the grain column. That's not just the title of the column. It's kind of the way I've always lived life. I wanted to be a journalist. I think this is part of the Jewish tradition. Question, to challenge. Friends of mine, people who I agree with, really find me annoying because even if I agree with their position, I'm often kind of playing devil's advocate and challenging it. And I brought those values to how I approach journalism, where I have a column that's not just my opinions, but I'm talking to Democrats and Republicans and trying to get intel and information. But I often, when I have an idea, I'll kind of say, is this going too far? Give me your best counter argument against it. Tell me I'm crazy. Tell me I'm off base here. And we'll often have debates and I'll often have debates and discussions with sources to really pressure test my ideas, their ideas, and that's how I kind of approach my column. To try to be ahead of the curve and come up with ideas that people aren't talking about, but will be talking about in a few months. But it's also reported. It's based on conversations with a lot of smart people who actually work in the political realm. So yeah, I mean I think a lot of that mindset is just kind of based in my Jewish values. The fact that I believe in being skeptical of everything. I believe in argument, debate, discussion.
Did you guys debate around at home?
Oh yeah, my folks used to watch the nightly news. They love watching like Peter Jennings and Tom Brokaw, and we would always talk about the news. I grew up reading the sports page, but that was sort of my gateway to the national politics. Reading the actual news, the serious stuff. But I knew I wanted to be a journalist early on. I really was fascinated by politics, at a pretty young age. And I didn't want to get into politics. I wanted to cover it, report on it, write about it, and challenge people in power, ask the questions of the people that are in charge.
Great. Well, listen, Josh, keep on cutting against the grain. We really need that ability in our journalists and our political commentators. I really appreciate your time and look forward to talking more politics with you in the future. I may bring you on again as things start to heat up politically, because I think you provide a unique perspective. So thanks a million.
Thanks, David.
Be well.